Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be back at the Explorers Club, and I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces. And what a sellout tonight, Roger. Amazing. You deserve every single person that's here. So I had to write this out for myself because Roger is such an extraordinary person that I didn't want to miss out on anything. My name is Ann Passer. I'm one of the former vice presidents of the club, and it is a true honor to introduce Roger tonight. Dr. Roger Hartle is no stranger to captivating audiences with his surgical expertise and extensive medical writings. As a director of spinal surgery and neurotrauma at Weill Cornell Medicine, he's penned clinical cornerstones such as biological approaches to spinal disc repair and regeneration for clinicians and minimally invasive spine surgery techniques, evidence, and controversies. While these works are fascinating, especially if you're a spine enthusiast, that's not why we're here tonight. But I'm sure he'll be happy to explain everything to you at another time. An award-winning neurosurgeon and a perfectionist in all he does, Dr. Hartle brings this dedication to both his professional and personal life. Recently, a newlywed, he shares his life with his wonderful wife, Tansili, and his children. His commitment to improving access to neurosurgical care worldwide is also reflected in the neurosurgical mission in Tanzania, where he provides critical spine and neurotrauma care to underserved communities. His humanitarian efforts earned him the prestigious American Association of Neurological Surgeons Humanitarian of the Year Award, a testament to his dedication to global health and education. Tonight, though, he's here to share a different kind of journey. In his new book, Photographs at the Edge, you can buy it outside, just outside the door. We should all have one. Dr. Hartle explores the lives and legacies of two iconic explorers. Vittorio Sella, known for his stunning images of peaks like K2, and Sir Wilfred Thesiger, famed for his trek across the Rub al-Khalili desert. Through their stories, he reminds us that whether scaling mountains, crossing deserts, or navigating the human spine, the thrill of discovery and exploration is universal. Please help me welcome Roger Hartle.
Well, Anne, thank you so much. That was such a kind and wonderful introduction. I hope you'll stay. I wish I could sell out my neurosurgical lectures, but I want to share with you tonight. My name is Roger Hartle, obviously. I want to share with you a number of passions. My passion in terms of photography are Vittorio Sella and Wilfred Thesiger. Wilfred Thesiger, also a prolific writer. Both of them explorers, true geographic explorers in the true sense of the world, and that was really what fascinated me about these two personalities. Now, how come that a surgeon is talking to you tonight about exploration and photography? So I thought I should give you a little bit of a background. I work, my primary passion obviously is medicine and taking care of patients. I work a few blocks away from here. I just walked over earlier today from work. And that is really my main passion, of course. However, there is an interest in traveling and exploration, and I had the good fortune as a medical student early on to spend time in Central Africa and East Africa. This was in Malawi early on when I was a medical student. I always liked exploring, of course, learning different cultures. How is medicine being performed under very, very difficult circumstances? So when I was a medical student, I spent 3 months in Malawi. That was during the AIDS pandemic. That was really a terrible time, of course, in New York especially, but also in different parts of the world. And it really taught me how to take care of patients and how to develop a compassionate kind of view on medicine. I learned about basic surgical skills. And as my journey then continued and I became a neurosurgeon, I always wanted to come back and give back to communities. And I was told then that for neurosurgery, there's really not a big role in developing countries, which was quite surprising. I talked to Doctors Without Borders and others, and of course they have infectious disease priorities, OBGYN and so forth. It was only then, years later, when I had the good fortune of taking care of this patient, Jakaya Kikwete, who had just been elected president of Tanzania, and he happened to have a neck problem. And he was being told that he needed spine surgery. And we treated him here at the hospital, and we actually kept him away from surgery. So we treated him without surgery. He was very happy. And he invited me to come to Tanzania in 2008. 2008, I came back to Tanzania. And while I was there, I spent about a week in the local hospital in Dar es Salaam. And I met this gentleman here, Dr. Kinasha. And Dr. Kinasha was one of 3 neurosurgeons who took care of 40 million people in Tanzania at the time, which was crazy. And they were all in the same hospital in Dar es Salaam. And then we went on rounds, and they showed me some of the patients that they were taking care of, some of the injuries. And then he walked me into the operating room, and this was the neurosurgical equipment in the operating room. And even if you're not in the medical field, you'll see this is rather basic and very crude. But that was the situation, less than 20 years ago, and these were the types of injuries, a lot of head injuries, spinal trauma, children with hydrocephalus, terrible brain tumors, and they just didn't have the equipment. They had a lot of talent, a lot of smart people, but not the training and the equipment to really take care of these types of problems. So I went back every year, and we created a program together with colleagues, friends from really all over the world and other institutions as well. But we created a sustainable program to really teach and train neurosurgeons in Tanzania, also nurses, ICU doctors, and now introduced cutting-edge technology for teaching and training, such as virtual reality. We've been teaching with some of my colleagues from Italy and Palestine, great deformity surgeons. We've been teaching courses about scoliosis surgery, minimally invasive surgery. We have the surgeons wear goggles there, and we can instruct them from New York via Wi-Fi. And then more recently, we introduced spinal navigation, so 3D guided spinal navigation. So these surgeons in Tanzania can do spine surgery, now also brain surgery, much safer and much more effectively. So this has been an incredible experience. And now they have 25 neurosurgeons in Tanzania for 50 million people. It's still not enough, but it's much better than a few years ago. So that's that's then really how I got involved, I guess, in the Explorer Club. And then Phil Arard is here. He really pushed me very, very hard, and I'm very thankful to Phil, and then Lee Ellman, who can't be here tonight. But a lot of friends who really got me involved in the Explorer Club. So I'm very thankful for that. But why am I talking about neurosurgery at the Explorer Club? Well, I wanted to share this with you because these are some of the things that we talk to applicants. We have hundreds of young doctors who want to become neurosurgeons every year. And these are the values that we look for in ourselves, our colleagues, but also in applicants when we talk about neurosurgery. What are the things that we're looking for? Integrity, collegiality, compassion, perseverance, leadership, and curiosity. And now look at this. If you read this wonderful book by Martin Dugard, he talks about some of the core values and qualities that explorers have or should have. This is essentially the same thing. It's self-discipline, courage, independence, perseverance, passion, curiosity, and hope. So there's a lot of overlap. So for me as a neurosurgeon, I think it all made sense to kind of see parallels in the world of neurosurgery and exploration. And then the other thing that kind of struck me was that there's also overlap with photography, because we obviously we take pictures all the time, and then especially during these very intense mission trips to Tanzania, we had one year a photojournalist from Brazil, Andre Leon, who's an incredibly talented photographer, who won the Robert Capa Gold Medal for his work in crisis regions around the world, and he took really beautiful pictures from the operating room, from patients, and so we're trying to kind of overlap, the medical world with the world of exploration and photography. And then I came across Arne Næss, who probably is not a stranger to many of you in the Explorer Club. He was a Norwegian philosopher, but also a mountaineer, and he talked a lot about deep ecology and environmental issues, and he wrote about that. But what I was most really impressed by was his writings about well-being and balance in life. You know, how do you find well-being and balance in life? And he talks about passion. It's all about passions. So I have a passion for surgery, of course, and for medicine, but also for other things, and that's so important. If you really want to create, be a balanced person and you want to maximize your well-being, you got to have passion. And he talks about this equation where the level of well-being is proportional to the square of the level of glow or passion. So with sufficient glow, any amount of pain is overcome. And that, to me, as a neurosurgeon and explorer in a way, that really strikes me as a fundamental truth. So we can't really minimize our pain. I have a lot of patients with back pain every day. So sometimes you can't help them, but it's really the passions that outweigh, I think, a lot of the pain that you have to go through in your life. And for me, that means, passion at work, but also passion outside work. So what my passions are traveling. I've had the good fortune to cross the Sahara Desert a few times as a medical student. I go mountain climbing, I go skiing with my sons. And those are the things that I'm most passionate about. But then there are other things as well. And what are those? So now I want to talk about photography. And that is something that, in terms of my work-life balance, really struck me as an incredible tool to find balance and happiness in life. And how did that start? I mentioned it earlier to somebody here. I was in Oxford in 2000, and I walked into a bookstore, and I bumped into this gentleman who was signing books. And the book that he was signing was this book here, Crossing the Sands, filled with beautiful pictures of the desert, of the empty quarter in the Arabian Peninsula. And then I read the book at some point, not right away, but I was struck by his life story. And I want to take you on this journey a little bit, and I want to share his life story with you, and also the story of one of the other photographers. That's the signature in the book. And then years later, I took care of this gentleman here, who is Elliot Erwitt, who is a world-renowned photographer who unfortunately just passed away. And I shared with him my interest in photography. And he said, well, Roger, you're never going to be a photographer, but why don't you collect photography? And I said, why don't you collect my photography? No, he didn't say that. But he said, well, with your interest in exploration in mountains, why don't you collect photography related to exploration in mountains? And that's exactly what I did. And that's basically why I'm here tonight. So I hope you get that connection between surgery, exploration, and photography. So that's how I started really collecting photography. And I'll take you on this journey first, the way that it started with me, with Wilfred Thesiger, and then we'll talk about Vittorio Sella. But a few more words about the relationship between exploration and photography, which I really find fascinating, because exploration goes back as long as mankind has been around. The more classic period of exploration, maybe from the 1500s up to the 1900s, was the Portuguese exploration, the Spanish exploration, British, and so forth. But it kind of tapered out really at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, what about photography? Photography really started in the early 1800s, right? And photography technically was at a point where it actually could be useful for explorers only maybe in the 1870s or 1880s, when people could actually take cameras and take plates, expose them, and then bring them home to develop them. So it was only in the 1880s or so where photography really was technically ripe for exploration. So there are not many explorers that actually are good photographers or became good photographers, because there was just not enough time for this really to happen. And I think the two examples that I'm showing you tonight are just classic examples that I'm really fascinated by: Vittorio Sella and Wilfred Thesiger. So two explorers who became photographers. Sella was also a mountaineer. Thesiger was also a prolific writer. So I put together this collection over a number of years. I had a show at the Grolier Club a few years ago, which this book is really related to primarily. I have currently a show actually in Italy, just north of Venice. There's a town called Belluno, where actually my mother is from there. And I have a show at the museum that's on for another week. If you happen to fly to Venice later this week, don't miss the show. It's terrific. So let's start a little bit more with Thesiger, and hopefully I'll be able to share some of the passion that I have for him with you. Wilfred Thesiger, really a incredible individual, human being, born in 1910. His dates are 1910 to 2003. He was born in Abyssinia. His father was a diplomat. He ran the British legation in Addis Ababa in those days. He spent the first 10 years of his life in Abyssinia. Incredible stories when you read his books. The times that he spent hunting with his father and then spending time with tribes in the region. He went back to Eton and Oxford, where he was educated, and then was invited back to Abyssinia in 1930 when he was 20 years old. They had a relationship with Haile Selassie. When he was coronated, he was actually, Wilfred, his father had passed away. Wilfred was invited together with his mother to come back to Abyssinia for the coronation. So he went back to Abyssinia. He had always waited for an opportunity to return to Africa. And he came back and he spent a number of years then traveling and exploring in Abyssinia. He explored the Avash River. He reported these findings to the Royal Geographic Society. He was greatly respected for the work that he did. And that's really kind of how his life as an explorer took off. Then he worked for the Sudan Political Service during the World War. He was a soldier. He was in North Africa, in the Middle East. He fought the Italian troops. There are a lot of crazy stories about those years as well. And then finally, or not finally, but then he ended up in the Arabian desert. He was hired by the Middle East Anti-Locust Fund to look for locust breeding grounds in Arabia. And that was really the obvious reason for him to spend time in Arabia. And during those years, he did his travels in the empty quarter that I'll talk about during the first part of my presentation now. And then he spent time in the marshes of Iraq. His book, Arabian Sands, was published in 1959, Marsh Arabs shortly thereafter. And then he lived in Kenya for a number of years and received the knighthood in 1994. So an incredibly fascinating life, tons of stories. I decided to really focus on those years in Arabia. And specifically those years that he spent in the Arabian Peninsula, the Rub al-Khali, and I know some of you here have actually been there, some of you have actually crossed it. I've only been at the outskirts of the desert, so I greatly admire all of you here who have actually been there. It's beautiful. But Thesiger spent 5 years there, and he actually crossed the empty quarter twice. It's the region between Saudi Arabia now, Yemen, Oman, and the UAE. Thesiger had obviously predecessors. He had role models. One of those, and part of my collection entails literature related to Thesiger and literature related to Sella. How did they become what they were later on in life? One of the biggest role models for Thesiger was Richard Burton, who was a British soldier, a diplomat, an explorer, probably best known for the travels that he did to Mecca and Medina when he traveled in disguise as Sheikh Abdullah, as a physician in disguise, and was able to get into Mecca. He took secretly notes that he put down in this book, Pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina from 1855. So also an incredibly fascinating and somewhat controversial character. He spoke, I think, 28 languages, was a genius. And then, of course, T.E. Lawrence, that who's known to most of us here with Lowell Thomas, who is very close with the Explorer Club, of course. T.E. Lawrence, who was a British officer who acted as a liaison between the Bedouin rebel forces when they were revolting against the Ottoman Empire. Also a very, very fascinating, a little bit controversial person, but very important for Thesiger. They never met in person, but Thesiger greatly admired his work, his writings, and wrote a foreword for one of the later editions of 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which is here depicted. And then I want to tell you a little bit about the other Westerners who actually crossed the empty quarter before Thesiger did. The first Westerner, so not the first person, there were obviously others as part of the trading activities probably for thousands of years. I'm sure others probably, and the Bedouins who lived there probably crossed the empty quarter at times. But in terms of Westerners, there were only a few who had actually done that before Thesiger. And one of those was Bertram Thomas, who was a diplomat who worked for the Sultan of Oman and was able to take some time off and organize a fascinating trip crossing the empty quarter from the south to the north with Arabs, with Bedouins. This is him on one of his camels. And I don't have a pointer here, but he started out all the way south, which is Salalah in Oman, and he traveled basically straight north to Qatar. He traveled with 15 camels. He had one guide who really joined him on the whole trip. But what happened was that they would hook up with, or not hook up, but they would be associated or travel with local Bedouins who would hand them off from well to well. So Bertram Thomas and his particular guide were really the only ones who actually did the whole journey. But they did this over the course of several months, and that was incredibly well publicized at the time. Bertram Thomas is not very well known today, but in those days there was articles in the London Times, New York Times, because it was considered like the last adventure, the last unexplored part of the world, the empty quarter in the Arabian Peninsula. And I found this online. This was actually the Explorer Club, Friday, February 12th at 8:30 p.m., dinner presentation, and no ladies. That's the Explorer Club. But obviously a number of years ago. So he was a celebrity for a while. The second Westerner then who crossed the empty quarter was St. John Philby, who was also a very, very interesting individual. He was a diplomat. He worked just like T. Lawrence during the First World War. He was communicating between the British and the Arab forces. T. Lawrence worked with Emir Hussein. St. John Philby was really close with Ibn Saud. So, but he was always involved in Arab politics and served as a communicator between the British and the Arab forces there. St. Philby crossed then from north to south the empty quarter in 1932. He also wrote a book about it called The Empty Quarter. This one is inscribed for Freya Stark, who was a writer, a travel writer and explorer in her own right, who's from the UK and northern Italy, and who wrote beautiful books about Turkey and Iran, Persia, and also about Arabia, of course. So anyway, interesting character, St. Philby, and St. John Philby. Now let's get to Thesiger. Thesiger crossed the empty quarter twice. He started out for the first time in 1946, where he crossed the western sands, and I'll show you a little bit more on the map where that is. And then the second quarter crossing was just a year later in the eastern part of the sands. I'm sorry, the western part of this. The first one was on the eastern side, the second one on the western side. And the Royal Geographic Society is going to celebrate his time in Arabia next year with a number of lectures for this. It's the 75th anniversary of his return back to England. And I brought the book here. I brought the first edition of Arabian Sands, and I was just going to read you a few lines. So this is Arabian Sands in one of the introductory chapters, and he talks about why he was interested in the empty quarter. So the empty quarter offered me the chance to win distinction as a traveler, but I believed that it could give me much more than that. That in those empty wastes I could find the peace that comes with solitude and, among the Bedou, comradeship in a hostile world. Many who venture into dangerous places have found this comradeship among members of their own race. A few find it more easily among people from other lands, the very differences which separate them binding them ever more closely. I found it among the Bedou. Without this, these journeys would have been a meaningless penance. So it's very interesting that he felt very comfortable in foreign lands, and you can see that in his photography. It's full of humility, respect for others. And that's why I thought that this was a really nice quote. Now, again, this is the empty quarter. On the right side, you see some of the routes that Thesiger took, and this is on the right side, the eastern crossing from south to north, and then on the left side, the western sands that I'll focus on in this presentation. And this is the Arabian Sand that was published in 1959, was really acclaimed at the time, was beautifully written. He didn't want to write about this. He wrote, like as you can tell, he published it in 1959. He was really forced by his mother and by friends to write this, and then he went to Denmark. He took all his pictures, his albums for several months. He closed himself up in a house in Denmark and wrote this beautiful book. That's the American edition. And I want to read a little bit more to you. And this is now, he talks a little bit about exploration. For me, exploration was a personal venture. I did not go to the Arabian desert to collect plants nor to make a map. Such things were incidental. At heart, I knew that to write or even to talk of my travels was to tarnish the achievement. I went there to find peace in the hardship of desert travel in the company of desert peoples. I set myself a goal on these journeys, and although the goal itself was not important, its attainment had to be worth every effort and sacrifice. No, it's not the goal, but the way there that matters. And the harder the way, the more worthwhile the journey. I think that's probably the best sentence of the whole book. It's really resonated. So this is the journey that he took. This is actually from the book, and then he, a lot of these explorers, they went back to London and presented their accomplishments to the Royal Geographic Society, and so did Thesiger, of course. So he started out all the way south in the empty quarter, and then he crossed part of the empty quarter, and then they got to Hassi, and there they actually had to get into Saudi Arabia. Now, he didn't have the permission to get into Saudi Arabia, and they were actually arrested by the forces, by the police forces there. And it was only, remember, Philby was the second Westerner who crossed the empty quarter. Philby was an advisor to King Ibn Saud, and Philby and Thesiger knew each other. And it was because of Philby's intervention that Thesiger and his companions were actually released from jail. And Philby then actually drove down from Riyadh and met Thesiger briefly. They had dinner and they talked about all this. And Thesiger had been released already. And they continued to cross the sands. He called it the sands, the empty quarter. And this is, and there was stormy weather, a lot of cold nights that and rain that they had to endure. At that point, they didn't have any guides, so they were always worried about losing their orientation. But eventually made it to Liva. Liva is an oasis now in the UAE, and Thesiger was actually the first Westerner to get to that oasis. And then from there, they went on to Abu Dhabi and to eventually Dubai. So that was the second crossing of the empty quarter by Thesiger. It was about 1,000 miles, took several months. He had 6 companions, plus minus, a bunch of camels, and it was an amazing trip. This is where they started out. I took a few video clips from this documentary that was shot by the BBC in 1967. They tried to restage Thesiger's travels, but I thought that this was really very nice and would really add to kind of the atmosphere of the whole presentation.
When I first entered the sands, I was bewildered by the utter unfamiliarity of my surroundings, and frightened by the feeling that I had only to be separated from my companions, to be completely lost in a maze of dunes.
Yeah, so this is, he had several companions. He was very close with 2 particular Rashid Bedouins, Bin Kabina and Bin Kabaisha, who he always talks about. He always refers to them. He traveled with them for years. I think this is Bin Kabina with 2 camels.
I had no desire to travel faster. In this way, there was time to notice things, time to collect a plant or look at a rock. The very slowness of our march diminished its monotony. I thought how boring it would be to rush about this country in a motor car.
Sounds familiar. He did beautiful, I focus on landscape photography in the desert, but the truth is that he really did beautiful portraits. Even more so later, he traveled in the Himalayas a lot in the 1950s and 60s. But these are two girls from the Yam tribe that I was always struck by his portraiture as well. And again, Bin Kabina was one of the companions that he traveled with in the empty quarter. He took a lot of portraits also of Bedouins, of course.
It was a life that produced much that was noble, nothing that was gracious. A few years' relief from the anxiety of want was the most they ever hoped for. It seemed to me pathetically little, and yet I knew it was magnificently enough.
Probably one of his most striking and famous images, again, Bin Kabina. And this is during the second part of this journey, crossing the empty quarter, in the northern part of the empty quarter. And I'll talk a little bit about his composition later, but it's always these high horizontal lines, and individuals kind of can't escape nature. It's man against nature. It's this fight for survival to a certain extent, and it's quite fascinating. We went to Oxford, where he donated all his photography to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and you can actually visit his, look at his albums. And this was one of the albums that we looked at, and I took that picture because it's such an iconic image. So his photography, he was described not as a photographer, but obviously as an explorer, and people called him a picture taker. And why is that? Well, because he never developed himself. He never printed. A lot of photographers print themselves. They take great pride in printing their own work. He never did. He never had an interest. He would come home. He had somebody in London who would print, and that was it. He had a Leica camera. He had a 55 millimeter lens. He had kept it in a goatskin bag. He didn't have a lot of travel light. He didn't have a lot of equipment, and he was never really educated as a photographer. And he would have been the first one to acknowledge that. In that book that I have on the left side, he actually talks about that. So why did he use black and white? And again, this is kind of a synthesis of things that I read about him, and I thought about that as well, of course. Well, he didn't really want to show things the way that they were. He had access to color photography. I think he used black and white photography because he could somewhat manipulate the shade, the color, the shade and the light to convey certain images that he wanted to convey and certain messages. He was interested in timelessness, changelessness. Composition is interesting, always the high horizontal lines. People are captured within the landscape. They can't really escape. And the subjects, though, are interesting, too. He always shows them with humility, with respect. When he is in the picture himself, it's always with great humility. I mean, he always tries to blend in. And I think that goes along with that quote in the beginning that he felt so comfortable among people that were not exactly his people. So on the one hand, in terms of his photography, he's really old school, but on the other hand, the way he travels and the way he relates to people, I think, extremely modern. So it's a fascinating individual.
Hour after hour, day after day, we moved forward, and nothing changed. The desert met the empty sky, always the same distance ahead of us. Time and space were one. Round us was a silence in which only the winds played, and a cleanness that was infinitely remote from the world of men.
Then finally they got to the Liva Oasis, which was essentially the end point for crossing the empty quarter for the second time. And some of his photography, I don't know if Sandra is here, but she's a member of the Explorer Club. She wrote a beautiful book about vernacular architecture, and they used Thesiger's photography there a lot from the Liva Oasis, but then also from the Marsh Arabs, because a lot of the architecture that Thesiger documented is totally lost. People don't know anymore how people lived, even if it's only 50, 60, 70 years ago. And architects nowadays are really interested in figuring out, well, how did they build in the desert, in the Marsh Arabs? How did they make these constructs? And how did they master some of the climate challenges that they had in those days? So he's really of interest not only for travel-related and exploration, but really in terms of how we deal with problems nowadays. This is Bin Gabaisha, close to the Liva Oasis. Again, the high horizontal line, beautiful picture and depiction of him and the hunting dog from his albums.
Here I was finding a freedom unobtainable in civilization, a life unhampered by possession, since everything that was not a necessity was an encumbrance. I had found, too, a comradeship inherent in the circumstances, and the belief that tranquility was to be found here.
See, I find it, tranquility, meanwhile you're almost losing your life every day because you don't have water, but he was just amazing. So I'll read you one more piece, and then we'll move rapidly towards Sella. But this is from the last page of Arabian Sands. So here he kind of summarizes his travels and writes a little bit about the Bedouins and the Arabs. I knew that I had made my last journey in the empty quarter and that a phase in my life was ending. Here in the desert I had found all that I asked for. I knew that I should never find it again. But it was not only this personal sorrow that distressed me. I realized that the Bedou with whom I had lived and traveled and in whose company I had found contentment were doomed. Some people maintain that they will be better off when they have exchanged the hardship and the poverty of the desert for the security of a materialistic world. This I do not believe. I shall always remember how often I was humbled by those illiterate herdsmen who possessed in so much greater measure than I generosity and courage, endurance, patience, and the light-hearted gallantry. Among no other people have I ever felt the same sense of personal inferiority. I mean, obviously a romantic, but beautiful words. So this was now at the end, really, of his second crossing of the empty quarter. So now he's all the way in Dubai, and he meets a lot of interesting people that teach him. He went on a sailing trip on a dhow. They went to Bahrain. He met Sheikh Zayed, who later on became one of the founders of the United Arab Emirates, and they became really friends at this time and remained friends for the years to come. So it was quite fascinating. And I want to thank Alex Maitland, who is the biographer of Wilfred's. And without Alex, I would not have been able to really put this together. He lives in London, and we visited him a few times. And I was always looking for photographs by Thesiger, because I have all his books. I have all types of artifacts related to Thesiger, but I was never able to find a photograph. And I would always ask Alex, how can I find photographs? I have no idea, I don't know. So we visited him, and then the second time we visited him, on the way out, he said, "Oh, Roger, by the way, I know you're looking for photographs." So he brought this box, and he showed us all these original photographs of Thesiger's, which were stunning, okay? And not only that, but he actually lives in Thesiger's apartment, which is something he told me then also. So that explained the incredible library and the artifacts. So I really want to thank Alex for all the help and everything that he has done to make this possible. Now let's move on. Vittorio Sella. So I'm going back in time. Vittorio Sella, 1859 to 1943, from the northern part of Italy, Biella, beautiful part of the world, of course. Very interesting, the Sella family, fascinating family, very much into wool industry. I think they became probably most successful with the wool fabrics that they made, but also a vineyard. There's a Sella bank now, a fascinating family. And Sella, of course, one of the individuals that came out of that family who's most remarkable. His father actually wrote one of the first books about photography in Italian, so there was a little bit of a background there already. His uncle Quintino founded the Italian Alpine Club in 1863, was a politician, was involved in founding the first Italian Republic. So you can see here an incredible background for Vittorio Sella, not only in terms of photography, but also in terms of mountain climbing. He got introduced to photography obviously early on. As a mountaineer, he made his mark really with the first winter ascent of Matterhorn. And this is actually Matterhorn here on the right side. This was actually one of Vittorio's most favorite images that he took. And he climbed the mountain in the winter. And this was written up in all types of alpine journals at the time. It was really a sensation. He did that with a number of colleagues and guides, of course. But he remained throughout his life an enthusiastic climber and mountaineer. Then in the late 1880s, 90s, he had the opportunity to travel outside Italy and outside the Alps. He went to Caucasus 3 times. Beautiful books, beautiful photographs came from those journeys. In the 1890s, the Dolomites, I'll show you a few images from the Dolomites. And then, of course, he became closely associated with the Duke of the Abruzzi, Luigi Amadeo di Savoia, who was a cousin of the king, and an incredible traveler, explorer, who had the financial background to support some of these trips, but also the organizational skills and the attitude to really bring those trips to fruition. So an incredibly talented person, and we'll hear from him, of course, much more. Douglas Freshfield, an alpinist from England. Then first they went to Caucasus, and then he invited him to go to the Himalayas, to India and Nepal, to Kanchenjunga, which is the 3rd highest mountain in the world, and they were trying to climb it. They couldn't do that, of course, but they explored the region around the mountain. He went to Africa, Ruwenzori, which I always find fascinating, with the Duke of the Abruzzi. And then finally, what we'll focus on is really the trip to K2. And during that trip, the most beautiful mountain photography, you saw one example outside, hopefully, but also the first mountain film by Vittorio Sella from 1909. This is one of my favorite images. I have a neurosurgery friend from Seattle. I don't know if he's listening, but he works at Harborview, which is a big trauma hospital, and they take care of a lot of patients with ski accidents and mountain climbing accidents. And he looked at this and he said, "Oh, they're looking for the 5th guy." I said, "No, you always think negative. I don't know if they're looking for the 5th guy, but it's a beautiful picture. This is in the French Alps, of course." Photography helps to select, specify, and even idealize the elements that can make up a beautiful alpine scene. Sella was not a great writer. He was really more a technical photographer and a mountaineer. You can see the difference to Thesiger here right away. We visited Biella. We went to Biella. There's a beautiful museum, the Fondazione Sella, run by one of his descendants, Angelica, who is wonderful. They gave us a tour. This is his darkroom, some of the equipment that he used. This is Ludovico Sella with one of Sella's cameras. Just imagine carrying these cameras up to the Alps, the alpine peaks, the Caucasus. He went to Alaska, Ruwenzori, and then one of his albums, of course, or diaries. I was always fascinated. My mother's from the Dolomites, and we have a place there now. So I'm always fascinated by the Dolomites, and this is one of the climbers who wrote beautiful books about climbing in the Dolomites in the 1800s, which was from 1896. And he used Sella's photography, of course. We have this panorama also from the Marmolada, looking at the Sella Ronda. I talked to some people here who had been there earlier. So the Sella Ronda, and then over there to the right would be Cortina. Beautiful panorama also from the 1890s. And Sella was just really talented. Then he went with Douglas Freshfield. He went to Kanchenjunga, to India and Nepal. And he took this image of Sinyachu, which is one of the mountains adjacent to Kanchenjunga. And this is absolutely stunning image. The sky, the clouds, the texture, the composition. And it's inscribed, actually, this particular print that we have is inscribed in the back by Vittorio Sella. It says, "La più bella montagna del mondo," the most beautiful mountain of the world, which is really nice. Douglas Freshfield, an incredible mountaineer. They produced maps, of course, always when they went to these regions. And then these pictures were used in multiple publications for many, many years to come. This is from a French publication from the 1950s. So Sella's, you can still see Sella's prints sometimes being published. Mount Llano, this was done with a tele-lens. You know, Sella was one of the first photographers in the outdoors, like mountain photographers, to use tele-lenses. And this is an absolutely stunning example. This is from 1899. And again, you see the cloud. It's reminiscent of Ansel Adams' work, and I have a quote of Ansel Adams here a little bit later. But this is absolutely beautiful, of course. And then Sella, you know, the very technical language, the wish to reproduce faithfully the atmosphere of the panorama, even more accurately than it can be seen by the eye or retained by the mind, delights the photographer. So he wanted to reproduce things even better than you can see them with the eye. And with that technology in those days, obviously, was very, very challenging, and I think he did a really good job. Ansel Adams, an icon, of course, of American or world photography, he knew about Sella, and he published an obituary after Sella passed away in 1943. This came out in the Sierra Club Bulletin in 1946. The purity of Sella's interpretations moved the spectator to a religious awe. Sella has brought to us not only the facts and forms of far-off splendors in the world, but the essence of experience, which finds a spiritual response in the inner recesses of our mind and heart. It's a little maybe over the top, but I think you get the picture. I mean, he was clearly fascinated by Sella. Now, I'll show you again this map from my from my high school, my atlas, my favorite book. So I used the atlases, the maps from that book. But now I took you to the empty quarter before I'll take you to the Karakoram for Sella to kind of highlight his main adventure and his main contribution, I think, to photography and exploration. So this is a picture of K2, of course, with all the different routes up the mountain. Some of you probably have climbed it already. I think there are about 400 or 500 individuals who've been up there. It's 8,611 meters high, and it's an incredible mountain, of course. And Sella and the Duke of the Abruzzi, they wanted to go there and wanted to figure out how to climb it in 1909. But of course, they were not the first ones to go there. There was this gentleman here, Godwin Austen, who was a topographer and a surveyor, really from British India, who was actually the first Westerner to put his eyes on K2. And this was in the early 1860s. And of course, he went back to London. He reported to the Royal Geographic Society. He came back with this very crude map, and I don't have a pointer, but it's really very, very crude. But for those days, certainly the best that he could do. And they named the glacier that goes up towards K2 from the Baltoro Glacier is now named after him, Godwin Austen Glacier. Now, the next in line was Martin Conway. Martin Conway was an art historian from London, also a mountaineer and an explorer, and he went with a group of Swiss mountain guides with Eckenstein and Zurbriggen. They went to K2, and they were trying to find a way up there and try to climb some of the other mountains. They were not that successful, but he also brought a very talented painter, McCormick, who painted the first picture or painting of K2. I don't know where this original painting is, but the reproduction is in the book that we have, Climbing in the Himalayas from 1894. It's a beautiful painting, of course. And they also produced a beautiful map that's much, much more accurate than the map that we saw previously. And then finally, the third influence really that led to Sella's expedition was Francis' young husband, was also very interesting personality, a British Army officer, spiritual writer later on in his life, a very controversial figure with the invasion of Tibet. There was a battle that he fought in Tibet that he was criticized for greatly. But he was also an explorer. He was involved in the Great Game between Russia and British India, and he was the first European to cross from China over the Mustak Pass to the Baltoro Glacier. So that was his involvement with that region, the Baltoro Glacier. He was then appointed by the British government as the liaison to Kashmir in the early 1900s. This book was published in 1909 when he was actually stationed in Kashmir, and he met the Duke of the Abruzzi and Vittorio Sella, and he helped them tremendously in really getting the expedition going to K2. It's a fascinating person. These are all fascinating individuals. And then when they came back, maybe this slide is now too early, but they reported on their expedition to K2, and Filippo de Filippi is a physician, an Italian physician who was always traveling with the Duke. He was also a mountaineer, and he was always tasked with writing the books. You know, the Duke wouldn't really write anything. He would always tell Filippo, oh, you'll write the book. And I know that because we translated some of the letters. It's really fascinating to read that. The Duke gave one presentation to the Italian Alpine Club on the left side in 1909, but then the Royal Geographic presentation was done by Filippo de Filippi, and that's the article on the right side. And this is from Riccardo Decker, who's here. She gave me a beautiful book. Thank you so much. It has a beautiful picture of the Duke and Luigi Amadeo di Savoia, Duca degli Abruzzi. I love that, the way it sounds. Not when I say it, but in general. So, and this is the book that they published when they came back after traveling to K2. Again, you know, they went there. They started from Italy, went to Marseille. They took the boat to India, the train up to Rawalpindi, and then Srinagar. And, you know, they had hundreds of pieces of equipment, a lot of people involved, of course. And then published this book again by Filippo later on in 1912. This book came out. Beautiful maps, panorama images. I mean, just a stunning publication. And this is on one of the maps. So they were able to get on the road and by train up to Srinagar. And this picture depicts actually the Duke of the Abruzzi and Francis' young husband with his wife. They were the British representatives. Without their support, they would never have been able to really do this. And so they all knew each other. And then Sella in the background, Felipe, the surgeon, and Negrotto, who was a cartographer who joined them as well, who was responsible for the maps. From Srinagar overland, they went to Skardu. They had to cross the Indus, which was quite adventurous. I have a short video clip of that. And then finally went to Ascoli, which is really the starting point towards the Baltoro Glacier. And this is an image by Cartier-Bresson, which I put in there because we have that at home, and it's beautiful. It's actually looking, the praying Muslim women looking down to Srinagar. This was done in 1948, so only 40 years later, but it's a nice kind of reference. We were able to get a copy of this movie, which is the first mountain movie that was done overall, I think, in general, and this one obviously by Vittorio Sella. And we got the permission from the foundation and from various archives to show this here. And I'll show you short clips. Obviously, it's all, there's no voice. This is in Srinagar. Srinagar is a town with a lot of waterways, and they used the waterways to get started down the Indus River. But it's, again, remember, this is 1909, and you really get an amazing idea as to how people lived and the circumstances, how this expedition really was started and was carried out. In Skardu, then, they organized a polo game to honor the Duke of the Abruzzi. And Vittorio Sella, of course, documented that. And we were there a few years ago, as many of you, of course, and they still do a lot of polo games there. And this is really stunning. Now, this is crossing the Indus River. This is the expedition in full gear. And what I like here is, if you look, now these individuals, a lot of them are barefoot. They carry heavy loads, and they're walking towards us. And you can look into their faces, and they look like yesterday. I mean, I was there a few years ago, and there's really this could be now, today. I mean, it just gives you that human perspective. Also, I'm not aware of anybody really dying during these. I mean, maybe somebody did, but it was not documented. I mean, whatever they did in a responsible way, and I think they did that very safely, and they really cared for each other. So you can look into these people's faces as they walk by, which is quite remarkable. And then, of course, the Duke on his horse saying hi. So they created a wonderful map. They invented a new way of using these panoramic images that Sella took. They took those panorama images home and they could measure of those photographs and use them to make very accurate maps. And they made this particular map of the Baltoro region. So they arrived at their base camp in Rodokas May 23rd. They went on to Concordia, which is the confluence of all the major glaciers, and that's actually the first time where you can actually see K2 in the background. And I'll show you the larger image, of course, later. And then they went towards K2, went to the foothills or the base of K2, May 27th, established camps, and then they tried to look for ways up the mountain, and that was very difficult. Two of their guides, Joseph and Laurent Pedigot, actually made it up to 6,700 meters, so 6,700 meters, using the northeast ridge, which is the ridge that eventually then was used to actually climb K2, but they couldn't make it any higher. And if you look at the map, you'll see that red route, they went further to the right, further to the left, so west, northwest, and then northeast, to really try to look for other ways to get up K2. In those days, they had no idea which one would be the most promising route. And they took beautiful pictures of K2 from some of those vantage points, but eventually had to acknowledge that they were not going to be able to climb K2. And they went back down, and then the Duke kind of decided, well, if we can't climb a mountain, at least we want to have an altitude record for those days. So they went up Bright Peak, Chocolisa Mountain, all the way south here, and they made it up to 7,500 meters. And I have part of my collection is a panorama similar to the one outside, and you can see Bright Peak with an indicator, with a mark where they wrote, this is the highest point that HRH, His Royal Highness, reached in 1909, which is quite nice to have that on the picture. And that's how they traveled. So they didn't climb any mountain, but they established a high altitude record for those days, which was quite remarkable. Nobody really got injured. Nobody died that I know of. And so it was overall a tremendously successful, really, enterprise. And this is now the Duke of the Abruzzi, the second one. They were still looking for a way up K2, up towards Savoia Pass. This is one of the most striking images, this Cathedral Mountain. And you see that little guide in the front. So Sella would always like to position people. Sometimes he would paint them in the picture. And just to get the reference. This is then, of course, eventually the mountain was climbed in 1954 by a team of Italian climbers. And we have, this is the image of K2 by Sella that's signed by all the climbers from that 1954 team. This was Achille Campagnoni and Lino Lacidelli were the main climbers who actually made it to the top. There was a controversial story with Walter Bonatti. A lot of stories, of course, about this whole climb. And then that's the Italian edition of that. This is K2, as you can see it from Concordia. This is the original picture from 1909. We were there a few years ago. And I just got this picture today. This is actually Pietro Sella. He's the great nephew of Vittorio Sella. He lives in Biella. He runs the banking business, but he's also an enthusiastic photographer and mountaineer. And they just came back from K2 base camp. This is Matteo, his son, who almost climbed K2. They made it up, and then because of bad weather, they had to come back. But it was pretty amazing. And then finally, I want to show you here really I think the jewel of the collection, which is Vittorio Sella's panoramic image, which you see outside, all the way on the left side, K2, and then Broad Peak, Gasherbrum, Bright Peak, Mitre Peak, Masherbrum. In 1909, and then exactly the same image taken 100 years later by David Brashears, acclaimed climber, filmmaker, photographer, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. But he made it a point to really find exactly the same vantage point that Sella had found. Sella would not take pictures from the valley. He would climb up to make sure he's at the same level with the mountain. But sometimes that meant that he would climb up to very, very dangerous heights and technically very difficult climbs. So Brashears had to do that, and he writes about this adventure. But he took the same image, and you can see both outside. Now, people always compare it, and they say there's not much difference. I was there a few years ago, and I'm sure if you took the same image now in 2024, there would be a huge difference between 2024 and 2009. And then obviously a lot of this work has been used for various exhibitions. There was a coal and ice exhibition just across the street at the Asia Society where you could see Vittorio Sella's work and also Brashears. This was a installation that was just across the street a few months ago that I took the video from. And then we had the good fortune to go to K2 base camp with a friend of mine, and we walked in. It was a beautiful view of K2 and the base camp. And I found, and then we came back to Skardu and the airbase at airspeed, altitude, and brains. I thought that was pretty funny. You need 2 of the 3 to stay alive. I still don't understand. Yeah, but anyway, and Reinhold Messner was here and a few years ago, and he was kind enough to write this for the book. So he references Vittorio Sella and Wilfred Thesiger, which was very kind of him. So this is my favorite quote. It's not the goal, but the way there that matters, and the harder the way, the more worthwhile the journey. There's one take-home message for me. The other one is this equation here. So, everybody's in pain. Just got to make sure if you have enough passion for things, work, family, outside work, hobbies, you'll overcome any level of pain. I think about that every day when I go to work. So, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
So, Roger, we're all grateful. We're all grateful to you for having so many different passions and sharing them with us. So if anybody has any questions, we're going to use the microphone so that people online can hear it. Hold on one second.
Probably not necessary.
No, it's actually for the people that are watching from home.
Oh.
So if you can pass this back.
Hello. Why do you think the first expeditions failed? Was it technical? Did they not have the equipment?
You mean to K2?
To K2, for right now.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I'm not a technical climber, but I would think that the equipment, the weather, just predicting the weather. I mean, nowadays it seems a lot of it is about predicting the weather, the circumstances, and just the lightweight equipment that was just not available. Plus, a lot of it was when Sella went there, nobody had ever taken a picture. They had no idea. And actually, Greg Charles, I omitted that quote, but Greg Charles, who is an accomplished mountaineer, he wrote about Sella's photography, and he pointed out that a lot of the climbers who went afterwards, like Campagnoni and Lacedelli, who climbed K2, they actually went to Biella beforehand, and they studied Sella's photographs. And Hermann Buhl, who climbed Broad Peak, they looked at Sella's photographs, and they knew, based on the photographs, had a very, very good idea as to where they could go. So the first expeditions, they didn't have any of this knowledge.
Thanks very much for this wonderful talk. I was wondering if you knew whether Sella was influenced at all by the Hudson River School painters. I'm just thinking of the big landscapes and the small figures in the foreground.
That's a great question. I don't think he ever traveled to the United States. He traveled to England. And he had a dealer actually in London that distributed his work. He donated a lot, maybe not donated, but he sent a lot of his work to the Appalachian Mountain Club. So the Appalachian Mountain Club had a lot of Sella's work, and they showed it in the early 20th century. There were a lot of shows in North America, and then some of this work became available, which is how I got into that. But I don't know if you knew, I don't know if those paintings were known in Europe. Maybe they were. It would be interesting.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering how, I guess this is more of a personal question, but as an accomplished surgeon and former medical school student, how did you manage to find time to mountaineer and do all these wonderful passions while also being a full-time student and then resident? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I don't know how to do that. Well, you always combine, right? I go to Africa to operate maybe or teach, and then I spend a day or 2 days doing something. You always combine things, you know. It's hard to dedicate 2 weeks to go like a lot of you guys. You go all over the place, you know. But I combine it. I do something, and then I add a few days before, afterwards, and you just try to sleep less and.
Thank you. I'm just fascinated by all of this. I don't know exactly how to phrase this question, but I hope you'll get my thinking. What accounted for Thesiger's rejection of the material life and his sort of ascetic approach to what he did? I know he walked barefoot much of the time, and I've heard that he said when he died he just wanted to be put in the desert for the hyenas. I mean, what
Yeah,
do you know?
I think the key, and I think he talked about that, I think the key was really his upbringing in Abyssinia, the first 10 years of his life, when he was born in a mud hut. You know, I didn't see the pictures, but apparently those were really very primitive, circumstances under which he grew up, and then he would spend a lot of time with the tribes people. He was fascinated. You know, there was tribal warfare going on that he could witness, you know, or the indirect consequences of that. And I think probably his mother and his parents kind of, you know, had to do, you know, they really liked that lifestyle, you know, and they took him on a lot of overland trips there, which he probably really appreciated and which formed kind of his personality. But he talks about those years being his formative influences, you know.
Thank you.
Roger, thank you. A beautiful presentation of Vittorio Sella and Wilfred Thesiger. But my question is directed to you. You're a neurosurgeon, and you ended the presentation by talking, well, on the slides, pain, body, pain, mind. Right. I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. John Sarno's work.
Yes.
And I was a patient of Dr.
Yes.
Sarno's,
Yeah.
and yeah, I would be curious about your opinion. Everybody in my group was cured of their back pain without surgery, and it's something I think about an awful lot now. And people that have read the Mind-Body Connection, you know, it's. I really want to know what you think about it as a surgeon. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. I was always a big admirer of Sarno. As a matter of fact, we invited him 15 years ago to give a talk, and you couldn't send him an email. You couldn't call him up. You had to write him a letter. So I wrote him a letter, and we invited him. I had just started practicing at Cornell. We invited him, and he came. He gave a talk. I mean, his views were a little extreme. You know, I mean, the extreme is always bad. You know, I'm a surgeon, but I would never say that you have to operate on everything. The best scenario is you operate on the ones that you know are going to really need surgery, and then there are certain situations where you know that with surgery you're not going to have a perfect outcome, and that's where things come in, like the mind-body, or even before surgery. You know, so I'm a big believer in really combining all those strategies to optimize patient outcome. But there are certain things, though, where surgery is really, really successful. You know, you got to be very, very clear of that. But sometimes it's not, and then it's physical therapy, it's mind-body, you know. But yeah, when I hear this equation, I think about bodily pain as well. You know, I see that in patients all the time. If you have a balanced life, if you have passions outside, then it's much easier for you to overcome back pain, for example. I'm a believer in that. But it's true for everything else in life as well, I think. Yeah.
Again, I get the mountains, because it's there. I don't understand just 1,000 miles of desert. You've done them both. I just don't get that.
You like probably Italian restaurants. Others go to French restaurants.
No,
it's
there's
personal.
there's gotta be
personal.
That's not boring. That's not boring. I just don't get it.
No, I can see the fascination with both. You know. Phil Erard has a question.
Roger, you have an extraordinary personal collection of Sella photographs. Could you talk a little bit about the history of how you managed to find and locate some of these great photographs of yours?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it had to do. Well, I discovered Sella, obviously, and then you go to auctions, you talk to dealers and so forth. But it was really when the Appalachian Mountain Club then decided to get rid of their huge, and they had like hundreds and hundreds of prints. I don't know why they decided to do that, but they decided to get rid of the collection, and that was really, for me, an incredible opportunity. And then you try not to tell anyone else. Yeah. Well, now it's too late.
The archival pictures are just incredible. And
yeah.
Deserts are the most magnificent places in the world. In fact, the same area, the empty quarter, in around 2018, was flooded with water because of a typhoon. So it constantly changes.
Right.
And that incredible desert landscape had lakes surrounding it. So it is really spectacular. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, you're working with a lot of new technology as well.
Yes.
And it was very rare to have cameras with the explorers back then. Everyone has a camera with them now.
Right.
How do you see the photography, the differences in the photography between the older and the beginning of photography and now that everybody has a camera?
Well, I think we have George Steinmetz here. Where is he? He had a beautiful book about the empty quarter with a different angle, literally. You know, he flew over the empty quarter and took beautiful photography. And when I saw your book for the first time, I thought, well, there's not much to add to Thesiger. But then I looked at the book, and it's just amazing. And it's color photography. It's totally different. But it gives you a totally different sense, really, of the landscape, the environment, and also the people who live there. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I think it's a different take on things. You know, Thesiger is interesting because of the whole combination, his photography, but then also the way that he writes. And that's why I showed the first quote. You know, he was so interested in living with other people like the way that these people live. And that, in combination with the photography, makes him so precious. So I think you got to always look at the context.
No, it gives us a whole cultural anthropology of the people in those areas at that time. Do we have any other questions? One back here.
Thank you again for the talk. This is also something of a personal question. When you crossed the Sahara, was this something you were already thinking about as well? Did these people already impact you? Was that something you already wanted to do from working in Tanzania?
Oh, no, this was in medical school. A friend of mine wanted to sell cars and was just, I always liked adventure, of course, and he was very good in fixing cars, which I had no idea how to do. So we teamed up, and then we drove those cars across the Sahara Desert. We got stuck a few times. We got put into prison one night. So it was not really, I kind of knew that something was going to come out of this, but I had no idea about Thesiger or Sella. I had no idea that I was ever going to, but it came in handy now when I remember when I was preparing the talk, I thought, wait a minute, I crossed the Sahara. So it was a nice kind of, so I think at the end of the day, it's all connected, right? But in those, I didn't really have any particular goals, with that particular trip.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You mentioned Lawrence. You also mentioned Philby as Philby Senior and then Philby Junior as well. Actually, they both were also political operators and political actors. And so, thinking about Wilfred Thesiger, was there a political angle to what he was doing? Were there any political entanglements in crossing?
Not that I know of. I never heard that. I think he probably wanted to stay away as far as possible. There's an interview with him online when the whole thing happened with Al-Qaeda and 9/11, but he's already like 92 years old, and he makes some statements that are more general, but even then you can't really tell exactly what his position was. You know, I was too old really at that point to really. But I'm not aware of any political activity on his side.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I can tell you one more little story. We have one of our members from the Explorers Club did the same trip as Thesiger.
Yeah.
And the
Mark
camels,
Evans? Mark
yes,
Evans, yeah.
and the camels now are not the same type of camels that you had back then. So they had to train the camels to be really rough and tough camels because they couldn't make the journey. So they had to really learn, as the people of the same area also have to learn how to get back into living in the desert. And it's been quite an experience for Mark.
And then the other thing, then he writes about also the well. There are no wells, so nobody knows where the wells are. Back then, Thesiger, you know, they knew people who knew where the wells were.
All the nomads, all the Bedouins knew
it.
it.
Nobody knows, so it makes it impossible to really repeat this trip. It's really empty now.
So I'd like to thank everybody for coming this evening, and especially to thank Roger.
Thank you.
And I think the moral here is go with your passion. Whatever it is, go with it and enjoy it. Thank you, everybody.
Well,
Do you have any along the shores? Along the shore? Oh my God. You did do it outside.